What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm gonna do some painting on the Civic. I was doing some work on the intake manifold and I decided to take it off, and I thought now's a perfect opportunity to actually do a bit of painting in the bay. So I've just gone down Super Cheap Auto. They had their Boxing Day sale and I got some paint supplies. I'm not going to remove the whole engine, so I'm just going to do an engine in respray. So I'm just going to show you how to do one of them. It's pretty simple. You can just do one over the weekend. It's not too much effort. In terms of the paints, the products I used I got all from Super Cheap Auto. So for the primer I use this one. It's actually a high build filler. So if there's any scratches or dings or dents, if you do a couple coats of this, it fills everything in. Just a bit of wet sanding after is easy. And then for the clear, this one highly recommend, this deep crystal clear coat. Always get a really glossy finish with this. Bit of polish after a week or two. Amazing. It looks like 2-pack, but it's acrylic. And then this is the color. So this is a Milano red, the original color this car was in. If you're curious, that is the code if you want to ask for it to be made, and they're about $30 a can each. So I used 2 cans of that. I got a little bit left. This is after. Used pretty much the whole can of primer and the whole can of clear. You're also going to need some wet and dry sandpaper. I recommend some 400 first, just to scuff up the body of the car, and then some 800 after to finish down the primer. You're also going to need some wax and grease. This one's also from Super Cheap, but you could buy larger bottles from Bunnings. I got this from Super Cheap, but also they sell sheets of it at Bunnings and small rolls. Optional as well is the heat gun. Heat gun is going to help dry your paint or your primer a bit quicker, and I also use it to heat up the cans before I use it. I find that if you can heat the can up at least to like 40 degrees, 50 degrees before you use it, it's going to help the spray come out of the can. Like, the pattern is going to look a lot better. It's going to be a lot more consistent, and also the paint's going to set a bit quicker as well, which helps the whole process. Some people, if they don't have the gun, they soak the can in some hot water before they start. You're also going to need some masking tape, some painter's tape, and a drop sheet. This one is large enough just for the engine bay. So I'm just going to be doing an engine in spray today. So I'm just trying to target the main areas you see, like the strut towers, this front radiator support, and a bit of that top firewall. So I've just pulled off the air intake and the clutch reservoir and tried to pull the brake lines off, the fuse box, the batteries out, and then the wiring harnesses for the lights, the front bumper. Just trying to get to the front to paint everything. So I've just scuffed it down with some 400 just to let the primer stick a bit better. And then I've gone and wax and grease the whole thing with a rag. And then I'm just going to be using some filler primer. So that'll help fill in a lot of these scratches on the front core support. So then when we lay down the color later, it's going to look a bit more flat. And with the paint in the bay, they only put a single coat of base on. They don't clear it, so it isn't as thin, and you can see a few sections where it's gone through close to the metal. So it doesn't matter where you start with the primer. With the first coat, just make sure you get good coverage. The second coat, you want to make sure that everything's nice and smooth and you've built up a thick foundation to sand later. I didn't spray the firewall just because I was trying to conserve some of the primer, but in retrospect I should have tried to done the firewall as well, as the finish and the color would have been a lot better. So the heavier you can lay down that primer and get it as smooth and shiny as possible, that's going to make your job a lot easier when it comes to wet sanding it after. If it is a bit dusty and dry, you're going to have to wet sand a lot more to get that surface level. But if you can lay down the primer as smooth and flat as possible, then you're going to just do a quick wet sand before you're going to lay the colour on after. So in terms of the primer now, I've left it for 4 hours and it's dried. So I only done 2 coats, so it should dry pretty quickly. Every half an hour I did hit it with, I've just hit it with the heat gun. Just not very close up, but just enough to keep the metal warm. Now I'm going to go over with some 600 with some water, wet and dry. This is just going to get rid of some of the high spots and any of the dusty coating that remains on here before we put the colour down. I usually prefer to use 800, but they were sold out, so I'm just going to use some 6. With the sanding, don't have to go super hard. You don't want to sand through the primer. If you do sand through the primer, just go back and spray some more over it and repeat the process. Just want to make sure that that surface is nice and flat and it's not dusty or any runs in the primer, because you'll see that on the colour. Then you just want to dust down all of that sanded primer and go back with some wax and grease after it. Now I'm just heating up the colour with the heat gun to make sure that it sprays nice. Just spraying the first bit of the can because the nozzle's usually blocked on the ground, and just seeing what the pattern's like. Then I'm just starting on a section that's not very important to see how the can sprays, because as they make these by hand, every single can is slightly different. So once I've done the less important sections, then I'm transitioning onto the strut towers. Not spraying the radiator support straight away because I don't want to accidentally lean over into the wet paint as I'm trying to get to the firewall. Again, this first coat doesn't have to be super thick, just make sure you're getting coverage on everything. Sections where you didn't prime, you might have to do 3 coats of paint just to cover up anything that's underneath the paint. You can put rags over things that you don't want to get paint over as well. Again, on this radiator support, just focusing on the back first, the less important section, and then finishing up on the front piece there. Just leave it 15 minutes between coats and go back and do at least a second coat and a third if you've got enough paint. So this is the second coat now. I've gone on to the second can, just spraying a bit out of the can first to get started. Spraying off again, just testing the can. If this is going to be your last coat, make sure you put this one on heavy and you try and get as glossy a finish as possible, and that the paint is covered well everywhere. As you can see here, the paint started to dry and it goes into this more matte finish. Now we can see whether you're going to have any runs and you need to sand them out. If you have runs, you can just sand them with some 800 before the clear. Now moving on to the clear. Again, just make sure you get coverage on the first coat, and the second you want to go heavier and try and do 3 coats on the radiator support and other high traffic areas so you can wet sand and polish it later if there's any scratches. So this is what the paint looks like straight after spraying the clear. You want to make sure it looks like this, nice and glossy. If you don't go heavy enough, the finish is going to be a bit dusty and dull. don't unwrap the plastic and the tape at least a day after to make sure everything's dried. You don't want to let any of the flaky paint contaminate the clear when you're removing it. So I just wanted to show you, in case when you're painting you do get some overspray on things you didn't want to cover. So I've got a bit of red paint here on the reservoir for the washers. So if you just get yourself some thinners, so this is just a multi-purpose thinner. I paid $25 from Autobahn for it, and super cheap sell it as well. But if you just use a rag with some thinners on it, you can see it starts to come off. Also any lines. So I've just been assembling some of the stuff back on the car, and it's been a few days since the finish. And I gave the latch a paint of satin black as well, some new hardware. Just got the intake manifold off at the moment, that's why I gave it a bit of paint. Firewall. And then I decided to tuck the harness. So before, the harness used to run up along here into the lights and the indicator. So I ended up just running it under the mount here on top of the transmission. And I've just got a P-clamp here, as you can see. And then another P-clamp there, that silver bolt. And I just re-lubed it, and then it comes up into the light here so you can't see anything. And then for the fan, instead of the plug coming up the side here, I've just gone down the bottom and plugged it in. And then also the lube that used to run on this side, I've gone down, and I just made 2 holes in the seam pinch here, and I've got it tucked up just underneath the chassis rail on the other side of that. And just make sure it's on the other side of the metal here, so you can see where the wheels rub, that it's not actually going to touch that harness. And then I just unplugged the other washer that's for the rear, and I've just got the single pump on there now. And then the harness comes up through the washer hole and then goes to the lights and indicator. So I'm pretty happy with how glossy it's turned out. I'm not going to touch the polish for now, because I'm sure later on I'm going to get a few more chips and scratches. If you're not happy with the finish, you could give it a wet sand with some 1500 and hit it with some cut and polish after. But I wouldn't recommend actually polishing it until at least a couple weeks after, because the paint will still be curing. You need to give a chance for all that gas to come out. For the badges, I've just put new rivets on them. You can see on the firewall there. Alright guys, so that wraps up the video. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Still waiting on a couple things to finish up the intake manifold on the car. If you have any questions, I know this was a bit of a quick video, put your comments down below and I'll try my best to answer them. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers.